As we look towards this week ahead, I speak with the mayor and our new city manager about their efforts testifying at the state capitol for and against many bills impacting Minot. That conversation is coming up. And Binax testing at Station 1 continues this week ahead. Plus, we take a moment to recognize the first ever Citizen of the Year. That is all coming up this week ahead. Hey everyone, welcome in and thanks for joining us once again on This Week Ahead. For local governments, we have these reoccurring milestone moments. Every spring, we begin crafting the next year's budget to pass it in the fall. In late winter, we go out for bid on most of our construction projects. And every 2 years, in January through April, staff, elected leaders, and in many occasions, community partners shuffle back and forth to Bismarck to testify to the state legislature. We're in that phase now. The importance of our state leaders cannot be overstated. The bills introduced, heard, and ultimately passed range anywhere from determining infrastructure funding to how cities and counties can tax, to how the various levels of government can actually govern. The decisions made every 2 years can change your everyday life, at least in the communities that you live in. That's why this 90-day stretch is so important. It's also critical because it's only 90 days of 730 to champion funding for water projects, to lobby for a fair share of oil and gas tax, to defend your right to be governed locally by the neighbors that you elected. The testimony your city council members and city staff give need to be crafted flawlessly to make sure that the statewide leaders understand the positives and the negatives of some of these bills. Many of the legislators have never held a local elected office. Some don't know the nuances of how street improvement districts are formed or why we have the funding mechanisms that we do. That's our job, to explain that so they are armed with the right information to do the right thing for you. It's a ton of work, but the payoff, if done correctly, is worth every single second. This week ahead, we have a special city council meeting set for Monday evening at 5:30. The purpose is solely for your city council to discuss openly about the legislative priorities during this session. Hundreds of bills are being weighed and debated. There are thousands of testimonies submitted. Your council will talk about what the focus ought to be on Monday. But the game has already begun, and to help us understand exactly what the focus to this point for the biennium at the Capitol is, I want to bring in two titans for the city of Minot. One, an elected leader that can talk about the visioning impacts some key bills have for Minot, and the other, the executive leader of our day-to-day operations that can help us understand the operational impact of some of these bills. And joining me now is Mayor Sean Sitma and City Manager Harold Stewart to give us a glimpse at what we're doing in Bismarck on an almost daily occasion. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me.
Hey, good afternoon, Derek.
Hello.
Now, Mr. Mayor, I want to begin with you. You have made, I've lost count now, but dozens of trips to Bismarck on behalf of Minot citizens. I know one bill that is a top priority for you and many citizens is House Bill 1431. You actually wrote about it for your mayor's column this weekend in the Minot Daily. It's lengthy, so I'll try to summarize it the best I can. Now, it is an infrastructure spending bill that would provide substantial funding from the state for our largest and most visible infrastructure project. That's flood control. Mr. Mayor, you've mentioned the passage of this bill could save us millions as a community. Tell us briefly why this bill should be a no-brainer for the legislature.
It's a great question, Derek. 1431 on the House bill side is a bonding bill, and it's not specific to Minot. It is a very large bonding bill that has a lot of different communities and a lot of, I think, overarching spending components built into it. The one specific that you mentioned was a line item in there for Minot, $74.5 million for flood control for the next biennium for not just Minot, but for the Mouse River Enhanced Flood Protection Project. project, and I think that's important to really pinpoint on too. Now, the component of the 74.5, we also need to understand that there's $30 million of that is the $30 million that we gave back when the Water Resources Trust Fund was running short because of COVID. Just in 2020. So really the new appropriation is that, 44.5 million, but put together we get the 74.5. This is on the road to getting us onto a faster track, a track of construction for a completion date for the Mouse River Enhanced Flood Protection Project. And this is a narrative that we're really starting to change and embolden at the state, is we're no longer focusing on milestone number one, which is, stages 1 through 5 essentially within the city to get about 60% of flood control. Because I think that there's a lot of people that have just been focusing on that and that alone, but now it is looking at how long is it really going to take us to complete flood protection for Minot and for the entire Mouse River Valley. So if we can get through this legislative session with at least, and I say at least 74.5, it's a start to getting to the point where we can now have the bigger conversation that we're going to look at 80 to 90 million or more for the next 5 or 6 biennium to get us onto a 12 or 14-year build structure. That would save us over the life of the construction project over $100 million. It would get us flood control much quicker. And it would also keep those flood insurance rates from escalating, beyond that. When we talk about 12 years of increasing costs, it is quite significant between year 12 and year 20. And aside from that, look at how many resources, not only from the state, but locally, we're putting in each and every year when we are closing down roads, moving sections of infrastructure, tying up city staff time, all focusing on flood control. And we are talking about the reality of possibly 30 years after the 2011 flood, if we stay on the current appropriation track. If we could build it faster, that's even 21 years after the flood of record. But we got to get there. We know we've got to get there. We've got great support from the legislature. We've got great support locally. It's just a matter of now finding that will to get the project done much more quickly.
And this is a major bill. It's not just for Minot. This is something that a lot of communities can buy into. So there's some support that's outside of the city walls of Minot, which is going to be pivotal for that number amount, almost $75 million. Big number, right?
It's a big number. And then there's, like I said, there's a lot of other components built into 1431. There's $9 million for Career and Technical Education Center that's itemized for Minot. We're still pushing hard to keep that in the bill. We'll see. But as I'm told, the flood protection monies are secured, but we just want to make sure that we're telling our story and helping the legislature understand that this project has a time shelf out here that we want to take from a very broad time shelf and tighten it up. But to do that, we are going to have to increase that biennial appropriation moving forward.
All right. Well, we'll keep testifying, no doubt, as often as we have to, as that one starts to move towards hopefully an appropriations.
Absolutely.
Now, Harold, as city manager, you are tasked with making sure we are carrying out the services the community and the council want. The foundation of that is our annual budget. House Bill 1367 comes to mind, and it's one of several property tax bills. 1367, in a way, makes crafting a municipal budget a little harder by moving up the timeline and usurping some of the local governing powers of the elected leaders. How would a bill like this or any other tax-related bills that are currently on the floor or in committee affect the way that we are serving the community?
Well, there's several challenges to this bill. There's only a few different ways that we as a city have to provide funds to fund the services that the citizens in the communities expect us to provide to them. There's a reason why you live inside city limits, right? You come here because you have better police services, you have better fire services, you have hopefully better quality streets and parks and all those types of things. Well, all those things take money to provide those services, to maintain them, et cetera. And the primary mechanisms that most communities have available to them to fund that's through authority given to them by the state is typically property tax and sales tax and income tax in some states, as well as North Dakota, that are available where those funds come from. And in essence, what several of these bills do is in one way or another try to take away local decision authority as far as how we fund those operations and what the burden is. So, for example, Minot right now is in a unique position, as the mayor just talked about, with regards to flood control. That puts significant financial pressure on us on how do we fund those infrastructure improvements for the benefit of our community. And Minot, either through their council or through local ballot measures, have decided what is the appropriate way to handle that through sales tax, self-imposing tax increases to help fund those significant community needs. And the challenge with a lot of these property tax bills here that are being considered at the state legislature is they're taking that decision authority away from the local communities to make that decision for themselves. The intent is good, right, in that they're trying to minimize tax burden on their constituency, right? And I think even the council and even I would argue that that is a very worthwhile endeavor to try and impact. The issue is how do we do that? And obviously, we as the city believe that that decision is best left to our local citizens to make that decision for ourselves. So when you have bills in here that are either freezing property tax growth or assessments, limiting how much it can grow by, that's taken away that local ability to make that decision for ourselves. And that's overall our concern. It's not that we're against trying to find ways of balancing that better and minimizing that tax burden. It's that depending on what these rules put into place, you may run into a time when that creates a significant wall and barrier that we no longer have the ability to address the needs locally that we need to address.
Sort of to that, if I may, there's an aspect that a lot of legislators may not think of because they don't have to craft municipal budgets. It's when you cap something at a 3% annual growth, just for example, generally municipalities knowing that's their cap will just do that constantly. There's no benefit for citizens to actually get a reduction because they're afraid of taking that leverage away from future budgets if something were to happen.
Yeah, and ultimately, when I was in Nebraska had a similar type of state law already in place that capped how much that property tax could grow year from year. And really what it had was an adverse effect. The communities that tried to be judicial, and when they chose to do that, when they got to a point that they had a significant issue that they needed to raise property tax by 6%, they may have gone 10 years without a property tax increase, and then something happens and they need to raise their property tax by 6%. They're capped at 2%. They can't do that. But those communities that just took that 2% every year, whether they needed it or not, that abused that power, they were sitting well. But because those communities that chose to be judicious on that and not pull that trigger unless they really needed it, when they got it to where they really needed it, they didn't have the ability to do it to the extent that they needed. And that's the danger of some of these bills, is it really takes that local flexibility and that local decision making away.
All right. Now, there's one thing that you did mention that I did want to hone in on. You said that there's reasons you live in a city. There's also reasons why you live outside a city. So this question's sort of for both of you. Either of you can kind of chime in as you wish. On Thursday of just this past week, Council President Carrie Evans, Vice President, Carrie Evans, testified on behalf of the city against House Bill 1165. This bill would give those in what's known as the extraterritorial zone a say in city elections. For those unaware, the ET zones are the 2 miles outside of city limits. Those properties fall under the city jurisdiction for zoning or building requirements. They do not pay city property tax. They merely have to follow the zoning codes by state law. A passage of House Bill 1165 will effectively flip the term we Americans use to create the existence of our country, which was taxation without representation. But if House Bill 1165 passes, those outside the city will actually have representation without taxation. How else would 1165 impact cities across the state?
Well, Derek, I'll jump on this one to begin with, and I think this is a reactionary bill from last legislative session that had to do with the ET area that had the permitting issue that arose. And I look at this one as a far overreach of reaction or ideas that the ET folks that absolutely live outside of city limits and enjoy a lower tax base because of that. But to say that they're going to have an equal voice in what the taxation issues are within the community, the ordinances within the community, and even the representation within the community, but uh, are held to very limited ordinances themselves. And you said it yourself. The zoning is extended out into the ET because of growth, future growth plans. So it really creates an unfair paradigm actually for the people living inside of Minot, because you have people that that will not have to follow the exact same ordinances that perhaps might be voted on, or the representation. So it creates a very large inequity. I was really surprised to see this bill with this type of language at the state legislature, because it would be no different than saying South Dakotans can vote for every election in North Dakota, but don't have any of the same laws, ordinance, or taxation in their state. It's really the same thing.
I'd like to add to that, and I kind of want to go back to a little bit of the foundation of why this authority lies with cities anyway, in these extraterritorial jurisdictions to regulate anything they do when they're outside city limits. And this is, in government over the last several decades, government has been in a position where we've been in a reactionary position as opposed to a preventative position. And this is one of the few cases where we have the ability to be preventative. So the theory behind this is that communities are going to grow, right? Their boundaries are going to expand and grow. And these extraterritorial jurisdiction areas are buffer zones where there is a public benefit to maintaining some minimum standards, because as those come into city limits, if those aren't done correctly, can represent a significant cost liability to the taxpayers. So let's take, for example, streets or stormwater infrastructure. So typically those types of matters are handled as development occurs. So a developer comes in, they're going to build a certain number of homes, they need this number of streets, they need water, sewer, etc. Stormwater needs to be addressed, and they design those and build those to a certain standard. And outside of the city specifications, it can be built to a lower standard. So if the city moves forward in 5 or 10 years and annexes in this development, if those streets aren't to current standard, or if those create stormwater issues for us, the citizens as a whole have to pay to have that fixed. And what can be fixed up front at a fraction of the cost now becomes a major financial burden to the community as a whole to address that issue. And so this is a preventative action. So that's why that authority exists, and that's why it's a good idea that that continues to be there. But the challenge there is that those people, those citizens, still have the advantage of lower tax base, right? They're not contributing towards public safety costs, police, fire. They're not contributing towards the city's costs of building new streets, putting in stormwater, those types of things that we pay for those from. And so is it fair then that they get to make an equal decision on who represents? And I want to give a caveat here too, that they do have representation in the city process through the Planning and Zoning Commission. We intentionally have 3 county appointed officials to help participate in our conversations as we develop our ordinances and our regulations with those county elements in mind. So they do have a voice, they do have representation through the city process, but should they rise to the point that they get to vote on city council members? And again, as the mayor pointed out, there's going to be elected officials that make decisions that affect us locally that we don't always get a vote on who gets to represent that. We don't get to vote on the House of Representatives or the North Dakota senators that represent from Fargo or Bismarck or any of those places. And they're presenting bills that affect us every day, but we don't get to vote who's going to be there to represent and make that decision for us. And so there is a balance there. And this is really a suggestion to change a significant political structure issue that's been here in the United States and in the state of North Dakota from the very beginning.
Great points. Thank you. Thank you very much, guys. I know I'm keeping you a little longer than I intended, but this conversation is really important for the future and the now of our community. Mr. Mayor, let's end with you. Now, there's a bill that would impact the way you, your colleagues, and even Harold would lead through emergencies. It's House Bill 1260. Now, you've mentioned this publicly before, so I want to dive into it a little bit. While edits have been made to this bill, it's still deeply concerning. To highlight it, it would put a moratorium on the wages of the council and the city manager if any restrictions are applied to businesses, with the exception of health violations or street improvements. Now, this is clearly legislation directed at mask mandates, but for me, I see adverse effects in the state of other more common emergencies. It seems too vague, and sometimes restrictions do happen when things happen in our world. I think of a boil order in 2011, for example. That, by the language of this bill, it would apply here. You spoke about this before, and I kind of want to dive into your thoughts and concerns with this bill.
I'm glad you brought this one up, Derek, on 1260, because the original language targeted department heads, it targeted employees that were making over X number of dollars. Now it's been refined down to essentially say, in an emergency situation that adversely affects any business in any way, that the elected officials of a city and the city manager's pay will automatically be suspended. Now, it's one thing about the elected officials. Let's throw all of that aside for a second. Let's just focus on leadership, because our city manager is right here. And in any emergency situation that we can really conjure up in our minds, snow emergency, any kind of water restrictions emergency, that would kick in to the point where now our CEO of the city, our city manager, by state law could not be paid. I could go into the legal argument. Can we force somebody to work without pay? Mr. Stewart is under contract. Is that a breach of contract? Is this something that is so reactionary, that has been given so little thought on the number of emergencies that actually exist, and then targeted specific to cities and the city manager of Minot, because Minot is the only community in the entire state that has a city manager. Every other city has city administrators in this leadership design. And I say it's only Minot because the city administrator in the previous language was scratched out. Now, so this bill is specific to Minot in that regard. The reactionary to COVID-19, because of either mask mandates or actions that were actually even more extensive in other communities for early bar closings that was taken on by the cities, or the restrictions on group gatherings and things like that that were done at the city level before the actual governor stepped in to do that. It's basically a direct shot to take control away from communities once again, for fear of retribution, or saying that, you know what, the local communities are unable to handle any emergency situation, and if they do, we're going to penalize you for it. So in essence, what it's telling me is the state is saying the cities aren't able to handle their own emergencies, and that maybe the state needs to take care of all emergency situations itself and call a special session of the legislature, because that is within the context there, within those emergency situations. If they don't feel that the communities themselves are able to best make those decisions with all of the factors and the implications that it's going to have to its own community, if it's something that's adverse affecting their community in the sake of public health or just safety, that's into consideration, because every single elected person wants to see a strong, thriving community, and at the very least, does not want to have those emergency declarations that affect negatively within their community. So if some of the folks that are proposing this legislation, it really is stripping once again the ability for local government to best react to the conditions within our own community as quickly as they can. So It is a little bit troubling. This one's bothered me a little bit, and I hope our city manager doesn't take any issue with this, because Harold, you've been on the job for a very short while, and 2020 was all of the reactionary coming into this purview. So. And the other aspect that and I kind of hesitated on even bringing this up, but on a local level, would this have long-lasting effects of maybe a person not wanted to get into a position of a city council member, maybe think about not running now because of the adverse effects of not only declaring an emergency, but the sacrifice that's already being made there by committing a significant amount of time to give to the community in that leadership level. So is it a double hit to them in the capacity of their own earnings? So I'll leave my entire position out of it, but it creates a significant burden, I think, within the community to lose their CEO in the time that they need him the most.
And it's almost punitive to typically a person that doesn't even make that decision, right? A lot of the time the elected body will make those kind of declarations, and then it's kind of leaving a city manager just waving in the wind, so to speak. Great points, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate this. I want to end on something a little bit very quickly. We talked a lot about legislation we oppose, but are there some bills that we're in favor of in this session?
Well, I think if we take it 1431, it's a very positive bonding bill. There's a number of bills that we've sent down, folks, with even our economic development specialist, Jonathan Rosenthal, to talk about the residential districts for economic development. And I don't recall that bill number offhand, but there's a lot of great legislation that's moving forward, some that are going to be positive impact to Minot for intermodal and beyond. So it's certainly we put an effort into getting our voice heard as well, with good legislation that's moving through both the House and Senate side.
Yeah, the bill the mayor was referring to was Senate Bill 2139 with regards to neighborhood zones, very similar to the Renaissance zone, but a little bit more residential focused. And it can be a great tool in the toolbox for communities and trying to spur redevelopment and growth, and more importantly, infill. So we're not always just growing out, like we're talking about the extraterritorial zones. So we're not always focused on growing and expanding, but we're actually focusing on developing internally as well.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I took more of your time than I intended to, but this was a great conversation. I appreciate you for all you do for our community. Thank you for your time today. Good luck on any future testimony that you may be giving. I know it's a long process, but I don't want to undersell how important a biennium is for Minot and for every community in the
Derek,
state.
before we run too, I want to make sure to say thank you to our local legislators that are working hard for us down in Bismarck, because that is a significant sacrifice as well, being down there for 80 days, and it's a lot of work. So thank you to them.
Yeah, of course. All right. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate your time. I want to take a minute to congratulate a great Minot resident that was just announced as Minot's Citizen of the Year by Mayor Sean Sitma.
Congratulations to Vicki Fippens, whose volunteerism through a multitude of charity organizations locally and even abroad has earned her the 2021 Minot Citizen of the Year Award.
Vicki Fippens was described as a volunteer with endless commitment and maybe even more energy to many causes. Congratulations to Vicki. It seems as if this honor was well-deserved. As part of the award, Vicki will get a $1,000 donation to the charity of her choice in her name, thanks to the First International Bank. Now's a great time to remind you that the public comment period for US Highway 2 and Evergreen Avenue intersection is still open this week ahead. In case you missed it, the NDDOT is weighing 3 options for this intersection to make it much, much safer. They have a virtual presentation that's live right now, and we have a link on our website if you want to find that. Just go to minotnd.org/news. You'll find the article that gives you a little bit more insight on that. Check out the presentation, give them your thoughts on how they should tackle this project. It's your chance to be part of the process. If you plan on visiting any City of Minot building this week ahead, bring your mask. masks are still required for employees and the public unless there's some sort of physical barrier present. To give you an example, if you're paying your water bill at City Hall, no mask is required because there's a big, thick pane of glass there. But if you plan to join us on Monday for this special city council meeting, you'll need a mask upstairs in council chambers. This was a decision recommended by staff and ultimately made by council. Another week, another chance for rapid COVID screening at Fire Station 1 in Southwest Minot. We seem to have found that sweet spot with our operating hours. It's still a drive-through test, and the results are texted or emailed to you in as little as 15 minutes. You will need to pre-register. Do that by going to testreg.nd.gov. And the hours of our testing are unchanged. It's 8 to 2 on Monday and Friday, 2 to 7 Tuesday and Thursday, 10 to 2 on Saturday, without any screenings happening on Wednesday or on Sunday. All right, that will do it for me for this week ahead. If you have any questions or topics you think we should discuss, let us know. Send us questions to our mailbag. Just visit minotnd.org/mailbag, or you can just email them directly to us at info@minotnd.org with the subject line of mailbag. And of course, if you haven't yet subscribe to our newsletter, if you want to read this, instead, that's minotnd.org/thisweekahead. And if you prefer the audio version, we are a podcast. You can subscribe to us on Apple Podcast or on Spotify. Or you can just go ahead and follow us on all your favorite social media pages at City of Minot. Thanks for joining me, and enjoy This Week Ahead.